On June 1st, 2010, Floribert Chebeya was invited to a meeting at the police headquarters of his country. Unfortunately, the 47-year-old economist turned human rights activist never returned home. Chebeya was the leader of the Voix des Sans Voix, a human rights organization that made it its job to speak against the president of their country. The president I'm talking about has been in office for what seems like forever. He had changed the constitution again and again to remain in power in his oil-rich country. He had rigged every election, put every one of his major oppositions in prison, made them disappear or made them die mysteriously. And his best friend is this guy. If by now you think I'm talking about Uncle Putata, you're wrong. Anyway, I need to get back to the story I was telling you. The meeting Floribert Chebeya was invited to was to be held with the Inspector General of Police, General John Numbi. When Chebeya arrived at the police headquarters, he texted his wife to inform her he had arrived for the meeting. But that meeting never took place. Instead, 24 hours later, on June 2nd, 2010, Chebeya's body was found by some passerby in the backseat of his car in a suburb of Kinshasa. No blood or bullet holes were found in him. Some of his clothing was removed and his trousers were unzipped. Do you know what's even more surprising? According to these BBC reports published 1 month after Chebeya's death, both local and foreign doctors who conducted an autopsy on his body said the autopsy could not show with certainty the cause of death. If not because of the black pictures and names included in this story, you would have assumed it happened in Russia and the president we are talking about is Emperor Putin. But no. This story happened in an African country called Congo-Brazzaville, and the president we are talking about is President Denis Sassou Nguesso. Having been in power for more than 39 years, President Denis Sassou Nguesso has so much in common with Vladimir Putin that if their presidential biographies were written, you could easily interchange the stories of their victims and nobody would suspect any difference.
And in the Republic of Congo, opposition leaders have called for civil disobedience to pressure the government into withdrawing a planned constitutional amendment enabling President Denis Sassou Nguesso to extend his 3-decade rule.
The regime is very dangerous.
If you talk too much, they latch on you and they throw you behind bars. And, nobody really wants to really die.
They arbitrarily arrested these young people from their home compounds and at bus stops.
Arrests and intimidation of the opposition and of the media.
The police, acting with impunity, tortured and voluntarily executed these young people.
It's the dictatorship itself.
Who's been in prison for nearly 3 years.
I mean, people are in jail.
A former presidential candidate in 2016 convicted of undermining state security, General Jean-Marie Michel Mokoko, has been returned to prison on Friday.
Born on November 23, 1943 in Edu, northern Congo, Denis Sassou Nguesso was the last child in the family of Julien Nguesso and Emilien Mobara. Denis's father, Julien Nguesso, was a skilled and experienced hunter. His hunting skills were so good that he became a respected member of the Mbochi tribe and eventually became a hunter chief. This information is very important to our story, so let's dig a little further. You see, Denis's father being an extremely skilled hunter means that he possessed significant knowledge about the local environment, nature, tracking the animals, and survival skills. Since it was customary in African society in those days to get your children involved in your trade or business, Denis Sassou's involvement in hunting with his father must have been the foundation for who he later became, starting from his interest in the army. In 1960, at the age of 17, Denis joined the Congolese National Army. The boy loved the military so much that he got promoted faster than Usain Bolt could run a 100-meter race. For example, just 2 years after joining the army, Denis was appointed commander of military forces in Brazzaville, the capital city of his country, and by 1978, he was already a colonel. Between 1960 and 1962, Denis was trained in France for infantry tactics, discipline, weapons handling, physical fitness, airborne training, and parachuting. Between 1966 and 1967, Denis was trained in Morocco for advanced infantry and commando training, and then Denis traveled to the Soviet Union, where he attended the Soviet Frunze Military Academy, Russia. There in Russia, Denis was trained in military strategy and tactics, Soviet military doctrine, propaganda, and Soviet political ideology. Finally, the Hunter of Men was born. Some sources claim that it was in 1978 that Denis Sasso was trained in Russia. If that is true, then it's a great coincidence because in this same year, Vladimir Putin was in Russia as the first chief directorate for the Soviet Union's Komitet Gosudarственной Bezopasnosti, commonly known as the KGB. While these two men were preparing for a similar future, one of them was faster than the other because 1 year after his training in Moscow in 1979, Denis Sasso became the president of the Congo-Brazzaville. Then you may ask, how did he become the president? Well, this guy who happened to be president was assassinated. The military committee took over, while Denis Sasso, who was by then a major general, became interim head of state for about 16 days. Gave power to this guy who wasn't able to consolidate his power, then Denis forced him to resign and took power from him in February 1979. In the 13 years between 1979 and 1992, Denis Sassou Nguesso created a one-party state starting with the July 8, 1979 election in which he was the only candidate. To maintain this structure, Denis employed a typical authoritarian playbook: suppression of political dissent, intimidation, harassment, arbitrary arrests, killing and imprisonment of opposition and activists. For example, Vincent Silla was assassinated, Germain Ngima was arrested then died in prison, Jean-Baptiste Tati Loutard died of what was suspected to be poison, Bruno Ngwabi suspiciously died in a car crash, Fidel Okanda was assassinated, many others simply disappeared or died in some mysterious circumstances. What about the freedom of speech? Well, there was freedom of speech under Denis Sassou Nguesso's 1979 regime, but freedom after speech? Don't ask me about that.
What my leader here said, freedom of speech, everyone has it, but freedom after speech, that is where the big problem is.
For example, you could go out at any time to protest, but there's no guarantee that you will come back home. A good example of this was the 1980 massacre in Pointe-Noire. On February 22, 1980, students at the Mariane Ngouabi University in Pointe-Noire, the country's economic hub, protested against the government's austerity measures. The protest quickly spread throughout the city, attracting support from workers, traders, and other disaffected groups. How did the government respond? Live ammunition. Security forces, including the feared Presidential Guard, opened fire on demonstrators. Some sources claim that hundreds of students and other civilians were killed in this single event, yet no official investigation and no police or soldier was persecuted. Another event similar to the Pointe-Noire massacre is the 1982 killings in Oando, but I don't want us to go into that or other atrocities under Denis Sassou's first regime. Anyways, Denis Sassou lost his seat as the president of Congo on August 31st, 1992, but then made a comeback in 1997 with a military coup that could only be imagined to be a movie scene from the American 1964 movie 7 Days in May.
Suggesting, Mr. President, there's a military plot to take over the government. This may occur sometime this coming Sunday.
I'll tell you about it in a moment. Okombi Salisa was a devoted servant, a faithful partner, and a good friend of President Denis Sassou Nguesso. This guy was to Denis Sassou what Yevgeny Prigozhin was to Putin. I know. Now that I've used an analogy, you already know how this story is going to end. But I promise, Salisa's plane didn't fall from the sky. Born as an ethnic Teke like Denis Sassou, Okombi Salisa joined the Congolese National Army in the 1960s. In the 1997 Civil War, Salisa fought on the same side as Denis. In fact, he was the leader of the Cobra Militia, a pro-Denis Sassou militia group founded around 1993 with more than 8,000 members at its peak. You can conveniently say that the Cobra Militia is to Denis Sassou what Wagner Group is to Putin, because this is the militia group that won the Congo Civil War in October 1997 and helped Denis Sassou Nguesso become the president again. Some interesting details about what happened in 1997 will come later in this video because I don't want to bombard you with too many details here. Anyways, after he became the president, Denis rightfully decided to reward his warlord. Denis Sassou appointed Salisa as Minister of Technical and Vocational Education on 2nd November 1997. His portfolio was expanded on 12th January 1999 when he was appointed as Minister of Technical and Vocational Education in charge of the redeployment of the youth, civic instruction and sports. On August 18, 2002, Salisa became the Minister of Labour, Employment and Social Security, then Minister of Transport and Civic Aviation on January 7, 2005. On March 3, 2007, he was appointed as Minister of Tourism and the Environment and Minister of Technical and Vocational Education, Skills Training and Employment on September 15, 2009. You get the idea? Like Putin and Prigozhin, Denis Sassou Nguesso and Okombi Salisa were good friends. But then, on January 30, 2016, Okombi Salisa announced that he would be contesting against his boss. Yes, both of them had parted ways a few years before then, but again, I can't tell you every detail of every story, or else this video will end up being 97 hours long. You see, Okombi Salisa contesting against Denis Sassou Nguesso was as dramatic as Prigozhin leading a rebellion against Putin, and the end result is similar. 9 months after Salisa lost the election in December 2016, a warrant was issued for his arrest. What was his offense? Weapons. Weapons were found in his house, and since owning a weapon is illegal in Congo, he was arrested. Do you remember that I told you that this guy was a former soldier and a warlord for the president? Does anyone ever think that a warlord won't have a weapon in his house? Saying the former warlord of the president has a weapon in his house is like saying a teacher has a textbook in her house. At the end of the day, Okombi Salisa, who was 56 years old, was sentenced to 20 years in prison with forced labor. If you're wondering why he didn't fall from a window, it's because he refused to go into any building that's taller than 14 feet. Now, there's a part of this story I've kept to myself up to this point, and I think it's super interesting, so let me let you in on it. After that, I'll share a few more stories about people who fell from windows at the hand of Denis Sassou Nguesso, and that will be the end of this video. By the late 1980s, even though it was dangerous, citizens of Congo-Brazzaville were organizing more protests, activism and strikes, putting pressure on the Denis Sassou regime to bring in democracy. However, for a dictator, such pressure rarely works. But then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and on December 31, 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed.
Good evening, I'm Gene Randall in Washington. We are standing by for an Oval Office address by President Bush, as he contributes to a day even historians may have trouble describing. A day when Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as the president of a Soviet Union which had already ceased to exist.
Now, you may want to ask, what do the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union have to do with the president of an African country? Don't forget that I told you earlier that Denis Sassou learned his political skills from the Soviet Union. What I've not told you is that he became president under the Congolese Labour Party, a communist party, and his strongest ally was the Soviet Union. When the USSR eventually collapsed on December 31, 1991, Denis Sassou lost his biggest ally and he needed to look for a way to create a new alliance with Western forces like France and the United States. To do this, he needed to create what looked like a democracy, so he abolished the one-party system and organized an election under a multi-party system on August 8, 1992. That was a mistake. In the first round of the election, Pascal Lissouba, leader of the Pan-African Union for Social Democracy, UPADS, received 36% of the vote, followed by Bernard Colelas of the Congolese Movement for Democracy and Integral Development, MCDDI, with 20%. Guess what percentage of the votes Sassou Nguesso got? 17%! So, after 13 years of dictatorship, Emperor Sassou Nguesso lost his grips on power. But he's coming back, and how he came back could only be understood in the realm of Hollywood or a fiction story. So, let's get into it. In October 1997, Sassou Nguesso staged a coup to take back power. But this coup wouldn't have been successful if not for the support of this man who himself was a dictator in a neighboring country of Angola. In what seemed like a scene from a Hollywood movie, warplanes got to the sky here, moved to Congo, and together with the foot soldiers who were already planted, Sassou Nguesso took over the government. That, my friend, is the beginning of what I call Putin Pro Max in Congo-Brazzaville. From 1997 till date, Africa's Putin has only become worse. Torture and death for anyone who stands in the way of Sassou Nguesso. Suspending newspaper and media houses, performing what some called constitutional coup by changing the constitution to extend his stay in office, rigging elections by any means possible, crack down on human rights activists, police killing protesters, government forces killing innocent civilians, arrest, detention, and imprisonment of opposition leaders. In 1655, Louis XIV, the King of France who ruled for 72 years, said, "I am the state." This is the mindset of most dictators in the world. They get to power and then start believing that they are the state. The problem with thinking that you are the state is that you also believe that you deserve to rule forever. The world needs more leaders who know that they are not the state. Thanks for watching.